Good afternoon and welcome back to those of you joining us in the room, and a warm welcome to those who are joining us online today. My name's Helen Collis, I'm health editor at Politico, and this next panel we are going to delve into a new topic, looking at whether or not there is a miracle cure for health competitiveness in Europe. So arguably, Europe has one of the world leading life sciences sectors, discovering and developing medicines that go on to transform patients' lives and in some cases even cure them. That's in large part thanks to the rich and diverse and centuries-old institutions we have in the region, with laboratories delivering cutting-edge discoveries that go on to form the foundations for spin-outs and startups across the bloc. Some of these go on to become successful biotechs like CureVac and BioNTech that we're familiar with from the pandemic. Some do not succeed, however. Some of these go on to get snapped up by big pharma, while others diversify their pipelines and become mid-sized and even big pharmas on their own. But along this journey, there are many obstacles as well as enablers for the sector, both at the national and at the EU level. We also have several pieces of key legislation coming through the EU, proposals that could significantly impact how well these businesses operate in Europe in the future. And of course, the sector was singled out in the Draghi report, which I think we've heard a lot about already this morning, where improvements can be made to really improve the competitiveness of this sector. So we're going to delve into this and much more shortly. But first, a brief reminder that if you'd like to talk to people online about what you're hearing this morning, the hashtag is Politico Competitive Week. So, without any further delay, I'd like to introduce our panellists. So, from my left, we have Julia Delbrenner, Head of Unit for Food, Retail and Health at DG Grow in the European Commission. Gloria Gequier, an advisor for the Cabinet of the Belgian Health Minister, Frank Brandenburg. Michael Lowen, Chief Executive Officer at IDA Ireland, which is responsible for attracting and retaining foreign direct investment to Ireland. Dean Summerfield, Senior Vice President of Real World and Commercial Solutions for Europe, the Middle East and Africa at IQVIA, which is a healthcare intelligence and data-driven organisation. And Stefan Wokstrom, Senior Vice President of Europe and Canada at AstraZeneca. So welcome, thank you for joining us this morning. Stefan, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Can you set the scene for us first, really focusing on what Europe is good at in the life sciences sector? You obviously straddle both the Europe market and the Canadian market in your role at AstraZeneca. So what is it that AstraZeneca really loves about the European market, and why does it have such a strong presence here?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, Europe stands for a lot of. Am I back on again? Yeah, thanks. Europe stands for a lot of innovation. Europe is many.
Oh dear, sorry. Do we have? Okay.
Okay. So Europe is, of course, innovation. It's a lot of countries. It's a lot of different cultures. We want to tap into that. There's a lot of talent also in Europe. Tradition in research in medicines. So that's really an attractive place for us to be from that perspective. And we want to continue to be here. And we're actually looking for all the reasons to continue to invest in here. Of course, there are obstacles. I'm sure you're going to come to that. But that is actually the foundation of why we're here. And this is the foundation of our company and many European companies to have that base here.
So it's really the academic skills and that kind of rich network that I mentioned before.
Yeah, but if you look at it, I mean, years back, actually not now, but half of the new innovations in pharma, when it comes to breakthroughs, came from Europe. This was the power part of the world where, pharma companies could flourish and have really good science. But actually, today, that is free falling. We see it's coming down. And we look at the statistics today. Statistics are saying investments in research and development in Europe has gone down with 25% in the last 20 years. New innovations, there used to be half coming from Europe. That has gone down dramatically. In the last 5 years, actually, been standing still. US went up 23%, China 400% in the last 5 years in bringing new innovation from the research. So yes, it is free falling, even in clinical trials. So why is it like that? I think there are some fundamentals that are missing in Europe. And it comes to keep it very clear, 3 things. Can your investments be protected by, IP, including regulatory data protection in Europe? That's number one. That's one of the key things that have been looked at. Do we have a fast, efficient regulatory system in place? Number 3, do we have easy access and non-bureaucratic regulatory system for clinical trials? So we easily can do that in Europe. These are the 3 fundamentals that we're looking at. And actually, that could help this free falling to turn around. This is my view. Because this is the place to do research.
And we're going to dig into each of those 3 points throughout the next 40 minutes. Astra was founded over 100 years ago, 111 years ago to be precise, by doctors in Sweden. Since then, multiple scientific successes, acquisitions, the merger with Zeneca in 1999 have seen the company grow and grow. But more recently, investments have been outside of Europe. So this year alone, AstraZeneca has named Shanghai as its 5th global R&D center, and it's invested $300 million into a state-of-the-art cell facility in Maryland in the US. One of the recommendations from the Draghi report was that companies need to invest more in European R&D compared to the US. And I just wanted to touch on, what you've just mentioned here and those investments that AstraZeneca is making outside of Europe. And what are the kind of the biggest reasons for choosing those other locations?
Yeah, we're coming back to a few things. Of course, you cannot be basing all your research in one place in the world. You need to tap into talent across the world. And we need to, of course, as a global company, we need to be present everywhere across the globe. So why shouldn't we do research in Asia? It's obvious that we need to do research in Asia and have a hub over there. We have actually 2 strategic hubs in Europe, and we're investing also in Europe. So we need to tap into research and talent across the world. So that's why we do that, yes.
Okay. Julia, you're head of unit for food, retail and health at DG Grow. You're overseeing numerous pieces of legislation for Europe at the moment to support small businesses and larger businesses and to help prevent this trend of disinvestment into the EU from growing. So what is Europe doing to try to ensure that this sector doesn't continue to choose the US or China over Europe, especially with the latest developments, as we heard, for cell and gene therapies for AstraZeneca in the US?
Thank you. So it is, and obviously for people this is music for people in the sector, but it's actually true this is a very peculiar sector, because not only about the innovation intensity and the research intensity is needed, but it's also because it's a sector that really affects the citizens. So we have values there that are health, which is a value per se. In Europe also, the large majority of medicines are reimbursed. So in a way, it's not the final consumer that is paying the good, is the national authorities. And that makes the market different from, I don't know, the market for soft drinks, for example. And it makes the market also more fragmented, because price and reimbursement are a competence of member states. This is why what we have been doing forever, but a lot with the last pharma package, is to enhance the single market aspect of this market. It will never be like for soft drinks because of this issue of the client being the public authorities. But a lot can be done. And the recommendations of Mr. Draghi, and this is an independent report, but it's very interesting to see his take, all of them goes towards having a more common market for research, for investment, and he puts a lot of emphasis in clinical trials, because indeed when you are talking about the fall in clinical trials, it's because we don't have a European Union of clinical trials. We have a number of small national entities where obviously companies are more reluctant to invest as compared to the United States. So a lot has to be done there. Also, what we are emphasizing now and will be for sure, because I cannot anticipate anything emphasized in the next mandate, is to look in parallel at the two dimensions, the dimension of public health and the dimension of competitiveness. This is an extremely important sector from an economic and competitive point of view, but also from an economic security point of view, and all the efforts on critical medicines point to that. And it is obviously for public health, but also it has enormous value for social cohesion in Europe, as we've seen during COVID. Thank you.
One of the pieces of legislation you didn't touch on there, and we will come back to the discussion about public health shortly and clinical trials, but was the pharmaceutical legislation or the overhaul of it. I know DG Santé is leading on this, but obviously DG Grow is playing a role too. One of the main strategy there is to really boost the competitiveness of the sector, make it more predictable, but also to improve access to medicines for patients across the EU. We know that industry is not particularly happy with the Commission's proposal to incentivise launching new products across the EU by giving them a 2-year extra monopoly period on the market. I just wanted to know, well, maybe Stefan, you can give me your response to that first, but also Julia, is it an attractive enough reward? Do you think we should be looking again at other incentives to improve access to medicines across Europe? I'll start with Stefan, and maybe you want to come on the industry side.
No. No, it's not attractive enough. I mean, you put it very nicely. You say they can get some extra years of incentive if they bring medicines quickly to market. But it's actually not like that. They're taking off 2 years, which we can get back under certain conditions. And that also brings the regulatory data protection base is being lowered with 2 years. To put it very, very concrete, what does that mean? If you go from 8 years to 6 years, the new types of medicines are usually, we don't think will be protected by IP protection, which is much longer. So the regulatory data protection will be the absolute only protection. If that's the case, and you lower them from 8 to 6, and it takes 1 to 2 years to get reimbursement, the exclusivity time goes down to 4 to 5 years in Europe. US is 12 years. That's a big difference. So yes, you can't say that this is a very strong proposition to drive attractiveness for investments in Europe. I mean, innovation is not enough protected.
Julia, would you like to respond to that?
So because of the peculiarity of the market, as I said, in pricing and reimbursement is fragmented, but the goods are also authorized at central level. What the package tries to do is to strike a balance between the imperatives of access, affordability, and protection of the interest of the companies. The legislation doesn't come in a vacuum. There are a lot of other things, and if you couple them with what Mr. Draghi advocates, the idea is also to accelerate, and you said the regulatory environment must be more conducive to innovation, and one of the ways is to make it faster and more homogeneous. So there is a lot going on with health technology assessment, and by the way, one of the recommendations Mr. Draghi is really to accelerate, and even said something which is not the line of the Commission, an agency, because the idea is to get faster pricing reimbursement. So in a way, incentives to have access at the same time for all the citizens of the EU, which is not the case now, and to accelerate the procedure so that this taking out is not really a taking out, it's more a reward for a balanced approach. But yes, implementation, and this is what Commissioner Varelli has been asked in the mission letter to really foster implementation of the new package.
Thank you. I want to come back to clinical trials now. We know it's been an ongoing problem in Europe for a long time. We have the clinical trials regulation now up and running. It's supposed to be a one-stop shop for companies to come and apply to carry out a trial in Europe across multiple countries. But we know it's not really, industry's not particularly happy with it. Dean, I wanted to ask your thoughts on this situation. You're at IQVIA. Can you tell us, is the clinical trials regulations doing what it was set up to do, and what are the problems with it?
Thank you. For those who don't know, IQVIA is the largest outsourced provider of commercial clinical trials globally. So we have a perspective on this, working not just across Europe, but across the globe. The simple answer is not yet. I think there are many aspects of CTR which have the right aims, but the experience to date has meant that there has been under-resourcing for the change by the member states. There's also the degree of subjective interpretation, or different interpretations across the member states, particularly in the Part 2 packages. So I think it's a situation that is common across a number of very well-intentioned European initiatives, is the degree of fragmentation that then happens across into the member states. We've heard from Julia herself talk about the price and the reimbursement aspect is a national decision for all the good reasons, but that really does harm the competitive nature for Europe. So in the situation as Stefan was describing, where we want to drive innovation forward, even if we accelerate commercial clinical trials, if we can close that gap to the US, China, and particularly Oceania, which has benefited a lot in the last 5 to 6 years, we have to provide that commercial return and the launch uptake. Therefore, there have to access the 450 million people almost in one go and not have the staged approach. So the European HTA, JCA are all great initiatives if they live up to their intention. But what we unfortunately see, someone like GDPR is 27 plus interpretations of that, and that slows things down for companies like AstraZeneca, but particularly for the biotech companies, which are the ones who are driving the innovation. It doesn't make it attractive to look at Europe versus other countries.
So what's the outcome of that? Are they still taking such a long time to get approved and be up and running? What's the kind of end result?
So there's been a small acceleration, and the pharma regulation again has set the ambition from the regulatory point of view to shorten that timeline further, which is absolutely the right intent. But it's not just that regulatory approach for the clinical trials. It's also what happens when the trial goes into our hospitals and research centers. The lack of harmonization of the technology and access to good quality data means the startup times to begin a clinical trial in the hospital is longer than in other global competitive countries. And then the time it takes us to find those patients, to put them onto the trial, takes longer across Europe than it does in other places. So just solving the regulatory framework is not sufficient. In general, you take a late-stage oncology trial, Europe is taking 6 months longer than the US to complete that trial. And when you're weighing up the options of where to place the trials, particularly, again, if you're that smaller biotech, 2/3 of clinical trials are coming from the biotech sector today, they're looking at that, and time is money to them, particularly at that early stage. So we need to work not just on the regulatory framework, not just on the systems to start, but on all the process afterwards as well.
Thank you. Michael and Gloria, you are two sort of member state representatives, if you like, from Ireland and Belgium. What's your response to this? I mean, you obviously speak, Michael, to industry a lot, and you're trying to entice them to come and do business in Ireland. From the clinical trials perspective, is that something that's being embraced in Ireland? Is it something that's discussed about when they're considering launching in Ireland?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So you're correct. I get the opportunity to speak with global companies in Europe, across Asia, in the US, and in fact last week was just in the US for a week on the West Coast. And there's a couple of things come back that are consistent for international companies. They're looking for clarity and certainty and predictability. And that's across the board. It doesn't matter whether it's a clinical trial or indeed if it's in terms of commercialization. And when we think about healthcare in Europe, and we as Ireland, being a key component of that healthcare, I suppose, ecosystem in Europe, we have been successful in terms of attracting that investment and building both indigenous and indeed multinationals into Ireland. But more and more, that predictability that we actually could very much sell as being a core competency in Europe has become challenged. Challenged for the reasons we've just heard in terms of policies that are probably not as progressive as other parts in the world. And we have to realise that it doesn't matter where your company originates and what continent, they're looking at international markets. The competition for investment, the competition for innovation was never as intense as it is today. And I think from our perspective, what we're hearing constantly from our client companies is we have to look at it holistically. You have to be able to bring your innovation from the lab and you have to be able to commercialise it. And that has to be seamless and connected, and it has to drive, I suppose, if you want to call it, return, both for the states involved and the continents involved, and indeed the client companies. And that's something that's repeatedly, I think, that we hear on a constant basis. But there are many good things within Europe, but there's areas we need to strengthen. We need to strengthen that continuity between the policies that are here today and maybe some of the areas where, if we're honest, we're probably not striking the balance. And there are many examples of that. And I think we talked about biotech. The other area we need to be conscious of as well in the broader healthcare is the medical device industry. And just to say as well is that the feedback I've got on the MDR has not been very positive, because it has, in some ways, taken company resources to spend time allocating that resource to qualification on MDR and requalification, but it's taken them from the innovation and new products. So we need to be conscious of, if you want to call it, policies and what the impact of those policies might be, and whether, I suppose, from my perspective, I think of a policy framework as a national agency or within Europe, we should be putting competitiveness, innovation and growth must be the three pillars within our policy framework, and how are all of those three going to be delivered?
Thank you. And Gloria, from Belgium's perspective, we just heard there that the medical devices regulation is more of a burden for industry. It's taking cash and resources away from developing new innovative products, and similar kind of concerns about other EU regulations. What's Belgium's perspective on this?
Well, maybe there's something I would like to touch upon first, and it's the fact that Europe's competitiveness is also shaped by the fact that we are a market that reimburses a lot. And I think this is very important to highlight, that our industrial ecosystem and our health ecosystem is kind of interconnected, I would say. And there is an issue that I do need to highlight, and it's that these budgets are growing exponentially. For instance, in Belgium, the medicines budget is set to grow 7% on average per year. This is not only due to the rise of an aging population and chronic disease, it is also due to innovation, which is great, but which is becoming ever more expensive. And I think to set the discussion right, we need to admit that this is the puzzle that Europe is laying right now, right? The sustainability of your healthcare systems and the competitive issues that we are facing. Now, to aid this discussion, we did, from the outside, kind of agree with Mr. Draghi's analysis, which came after the Belgian presidency, of course, that a lot of things in Europe are too fragmented. Our responses to medicine shortages are fragmented with negative spillover effects. The way we subsidize R&D is fragmented, and the way we conduct clinical trials is fragmented. And I think there lies the issue. There are a few things that we put on the agenda, not in the least the Critical Medicines Act and the Biotech Act, which I argue should be the legal frameworks for a comprehensive industrial strategy in Europe concerning these sectors, the biotech sector and the critical medicine sector. We were also working on a system to guide on unmet medical needs, which is also one of the recommendations in Mr. Draghi's report, which I was very happy to see, and to set up a coordination mechanism for, in this case, publicly funded clinical trials, but which I think should also happen for privately funded clinical trials, because it's true that there is an immense fragmentation amongst funders. I think Europe has over 400 funders of clinical trials, public funders. There's a fragmentation in the ethical committees, there's fragmentation in the regulations, so this needs to be solved. And we concluded the trilogues on the European health data space, which I think is not highlighted enough here, how important this health data space is. Certainly if you think about our competitiveness vis-à-vis China, this health data space is immensely, immensely important, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. Lots of things to dig into there, data being one of them, as well as fragmentation and pricing. Maybe we'll go to pricing next. We obviously have, as we've heard, different pricing and reimbursement structures across each of the EU member states. But there are a couple of elements here, and Draghi was talking about the need for cooperation and coordination for EU pricing for medicines. There are a couple of things that are happening. We've got the European Health Technology Assessment, which is an EU-wide added benefit assessment for any new drug eventually that comes on the market, starting in January with cancer drugs, cell and gene therapies. And I just wanted to hear, Stefan, what's your view? I mean, AstraZeneca has obviously cell therapies and a lot of oncology drugs. Do you think this is going to improve access and create more of a European market for medicines?
You mean
the health technology assessment?
Well, the intention is good to make it a more simplified system that you can apply in one place and that could be used across, of course. But we also need to realize that we're now mixing central EU initiatives with also a competency to set prices that is actually every member state's own competence. So if we do a healthcare assessment on an EU level, and then every member state are then going to make decisions, and they're going to ask for local data. They want to do their own assessments. So there might be another layer, or there might be a simplification. If it is a simplification, we're very happy. But what we hear so far, there is a risk because that there will just be another layer, which will make Europe even more complex. And we need simplification, fast access to medicines for patients in Europe. Can this speed it up? Well, we will know when the first next year, when the first medicines are going through that one. But I fear that, as usual, we're mixing central competence and local competence, and that makes things very complex.
Dean, what's your view on this health technology assessment? I mean, I'm conscious that we don't all have healthcare experts in the room, so it's a lot of sort of pharma and healthcare bubble terminology, so the added benefit assessments at the EU level. Do you think it's been designed in the best way? We know that countries will have to consider the outcome of this assessment, but they don't actually have to use it in their pricing discussions.
And therein, I share Stefan's point that the absolute intention is great. It does simplify the process if it follows through. But if we do have member states asking for additional local data, doing another round of review, thereby introducing another delay, then we lose the benefit that is there to design. And you asked me a few moments ago about, is CTR bringing the benefit? I want to give a positive case, maybe because we've focused a little bit on the negatives from one of the member states, and that's Spain. So Spain knew this was coming. It embraced the intention of CTR. It embraced putting the resources in place for when the technology was there. And Spain has now become the powerhouse for clinical trials in Europe. AstraZeneca, all of the companies we work with, almost now the first country they want to put top of the list is Spain, whether that is in oncology with great centers such as Vall d'Hebron in Barcelona, but even into chronic disease medications with the large cardiovascular trials that are out there right now. And it has become the #1 state. So if you look at the positives and you take a member state who's embraced that legislation, put it and resourced it, and followed it through and not put on top additional local interpretations, then it starts. They are delivering the benefits that the legislation is there to, and the regulations and the guidance is there. So it's that piece. It's the don't put another layer. Don't fragment. Use the power of the one, and that makes us competitive against the US, against China, and increasingly against the Middle East, which is a region we're perhaps not talking about here, but from a pharmaceutical point of view, it's becoming a market that's increasingly looked at to generate the profits that may not be coming out of the US in the future.
And Gloria, what's Belgium's position to accepting potentially a new HTA assessor, health technology assessment, from the EU level? Belgium's well known for layers of bureaucracy, for those who do live here. Is Belgium going to be welcoming an EU-wide level assessment, do you think, and taking that into its pricing discussions?
Well, wait, I need to think, where is the competency? No. Yes, of course, we are very much pro coordination of HTAs at the European level. We clearly see the benefits of this, and we are also following the work of the coordination group. And it's true that you can see that a lot of the work is being delayed because the member states are not ready, the national bodies are not ready. So I hope this will be fixed soon in the future, and I also hope that it will not create an additional layer of complication. Indeed, it should help us make the approval system much faster.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, sticking with this kind of European market for medicines, one of the areas that has been discussed openly is the idea of more joint procurement of medicines at the EU level. We obviously are familiar with it a lot more after the pandemic with vaccines and various treatments. What's Ireland's position on this? I know Ireland is part of a buying group called Beneluxa, which attempts to do sort of EU or Beneluxa added benefit assessments and then pricing assessments, and obviously Belgium is part of that as well. Would Ireland accept an EU flat price for certain medicines if that was the way things were going?
Yeah, so I think first of all I need to say it's not my competency, so I can't declare Ireland's position just in case anyone thinks otherwise. But I think when we look at it, and if we take some of the lessons from the pandemic, for example, we saw the benefit in Ireland, as a member state of Europe, of the importance of being part of that collective, and that actually, brought a very good result. Not just for Ireland, but for Europe in terms of managing that and central coordination. And let's be honest, when there was a necessity both on the supply side as well as on the demand side. As we go forward, I would be of the view that, I think it needs to simplify, and Ireland has its role to play in that as well. We need to help to simplify that process. As a small economy, I think within Europe, we don't have the same level of probably ability from a clinical trials perspective, but there's areas where we actually can bring competency. And maybe back to the conversation previously, from an entire European perspective, the benefit of being part of Europe is that, we have trust in each other, and we have trust in what happens, whether it's in Belgium or whether it's in Spain or whether it's in Ireland or vice versa, and that we should build competence around that and trust, because that's actually what will bring the competitive advantage to Europe as a whole, because ultimately that's our objective from a European point of view and a citizen's point of view. So I would hope that we would be moving towards that, and that we can start to see more streamlining and more defragmentation of the systems that we have at the moment.
Thank you. I want to come back to one of the topics that was mentioned earlier, which is around health data. Arguably, Dean, this could be another positive story for us if Europe gets it right. There's a huge trove of health data across Europe, and Europe is making strides to try and harmonise that, standardise it, capitalise on it. We have with the European Health Data Space legislation, which has now been approved. Dean, obviously IQVIA is a data specialist, so you're the perfect person to be commenting on this. Is this going to be the knight in shining armour that Europe needs to really kind of say, wave the flag, we've got this great data trove, come and use it and come to your research here?
It absolutely has the potential to do so. So we are strong advocates and supporters of the health data space. Unfortunately, right now, there's a lot of details missing. So I think the importance is the work over the next 2 to 3 years in putting the details in terms of data standards. I mean, Europe has the greatest diversity. If you're looking at the 450 million people, typically the healthcare data diversity there is unparalleled compared to the other major geographies. The genotypical, the phenotypical, everything in there makes it right. There's lots of people collecting data at the moment, more data sources available in Europe of reasonable quality than anywhere else. And the EHDS looking to bring that together clearly can create a power to fund everything from research to better delivery of healthcare by making better healthcare decisions at point of care. devil's going to be in the details. We're going to need to make sure that things about standards, interoperability are done. There are good revisions made in the legislation from the first draft around protecting IP, protecting pre-existing pieces. But again, we need to see this being the same across the member states. And where we're seeing countries already saying, well, we'll take this bit, but not that bit. And we'll create our healthcare data access bodies who will allow this in one country and that in another, doesn't create for, whether it is a large pharmaceutical company, a company looking to develop AI to improve point-of-care diagnosis, doesn't give them that access to be able to do that. We want to allow that interchangeability across the member states, which is at the heart of it as well, if there are differences. So, the next 2 years will really tell us, as we look to put the level on the technical detail that are there, if we get a degree of standardization, then this really could be a huge competitive advantage for the EU.
Yeah, and especially on AI. We heard Kent Ward earlier today from Google and Alphabet, the benefits that AI has delivered in terms of really looking at the human genome and speeding up that sort of scientific development using that type of technology. Is there a concern then with this opt-out mechanism in EU countries that we're not going to have the data sets that we can really train AI accurately on, and there's a risk of sort of bias in those devices, Dean?
There is. I wouldn't say necessarily more so than any other data sources that are out there right now. Fundamentally, everywhere in the globe, and I was in a similar panel to this in the Middle East about 2 months ago, we have to address fundamental data quality. And if you're talking about healthcare data, remember who is putting it into the system. It's the hard-pressed healthcare professional putting it into their EMR system, putting it into their lab system. And right now, that separation from healthcare and the delivery of healthcare to the potential benefits that come economically from better information and AI, which may even go to a different department in the government. It's going into the Ministry of the Economy, it's going to the Ministry of Industry. It's not flowing back the benefit into health. So where are we looking at the resourcing and the flow back to the people who are responsible ultimately for that data quality at the outset? Trying to fix it later is so hard, so expensive. We know it's our day-to-day business. And again, to live up to that potential, we go look at the point of putting the information in, which is a hard-pressed doctor, nurse, healthcare professional working in the system. And how do the organizations they work in, see the benefit of improving that data quality and coming through economically to help them?
Mm-hmm. Julia, I want to ask you, as our Commission representative on the panel this afternoon, we've heard about a lot of pieces of EU legislation here, from the medical devices regulation, clinical trials regulation, the health technology assessment, and the European health data space. All sound good on paper, but they have opt-outs, they have loopholes, there's fragmentation still across the member states and how they interpret and implement them. What difference can the EU really make to improve competitiveness for the sector across all these areas?
So, as I said before, this is one of the requests in the mission letter of Commissioner Varela, just to look at the implementation of what is in there, plus put forward the Critical Medicines Act and the Biotech Act, because the main challenge of EU legislation in pharma is to follow the developments, the technological developments in the sector, which are huge, but that requires a lot of caution, because affordability, because safety, because in the case of data, protection of the data. So this is something that perhaps is done in a not perfect way, but as we protect data for individuals in the health sector in Europe, I think we are an example of that. Also because it can have dreadful consequences, for example, for insurance. So it's not something to be taken lightly. Now we have this big emphasis on competitiveness, which I think helps to put all these things together, but we shall not forget this is a sector where affordability, solidarity, and safety count a lot. We talked before about public procurement, and you said a flat price. During the COVID crisis, when we did advanced purchase agreements, a part of the vaccines were paid by the budget of the European Commission, which means it was not a flat price. because solidarity is still important, and solidarity must be achieved in a way that doesn't put the countries with lower prices of less big budgets in a difficult position. When I started working with pricing and reimbursement, basically what happened is we had a couple of member states who had health technology assessment, and then the others just waited for their basket of countries. So if the basket of countries was, the less expensive countries, then you would come last, and that means people getting cured and people not getting cured and dying, possibly. So I think what happened during COVID with the support and engagement of all these people, all of this, was that everybody got the vaccines at the same time, and not with the same price, and with incredible R&D and innovation behind that, and incredible logistics and incredible nurses that helped us. And this has to be an example on the working together in a way that benefits everybody. And for all of that, we need all the package to be implemented. We need the Biotech Act, we need the Critical Medicines Act, and more.
Thank you. We tend to fixate really on the innovative medicine sector when we talk about competitiveness in Europe, which is really the sort of the basis of the Draghi report section on this. But Gloria, there seems to be, if you think about it, 70% of the medicines that Europeans use are from the generic sector. Arguably, this is a sector that is also struggling. It has supply chain problems with dependencies in in India and China. And some companies are withdrawing their products from the market because of pricing pressures and various other things which make it no longer profitable to be in Europe. So, what has gone wrong with the generic sector, and should we really be talking about how to make this sector more competitive in Europe?
I think a number of issues are going wrong in the generic sector, but it is undeniable that in this sector, price competition really has consolidated the market around a few global players. It has also stretched out supply chains, meaning that Europe will be responsible for the fill and finish, for instance, of a product, but will not be producing the components or the APIs anymore. And this exposes us to security challenges, but also to disruptions within the supply chains that can have negative overall consequences. To remediate this problem, we have indeed proposed the Critical Medicines Act, which was now taken on board by the Commission, which should, in essence, consist of two components. One is an industrial component, where you really look at the technologies that could make production in Europe competitive again, that would help companies make the green transition, lower energy costs, and so on. Another component of this Critical Medicines Act is to make the market more sustainable. And here, of course, we are looking at public procurement and the integration of meet criteria. But we are also looking at pricing and reimbursement, right? Because one thing that was not highlighted here is that the prices of products are tightly connected to the reimbursement. And that's why it's very difficult to have a European flat price, because you would end up with a reference price which is always higher than what you would in fact pay. But you can think of systems with a price fork, where you have a floor price and a ceiling price, let's say, which allows member states to differentiate a little bit, but also prevents them from pushing the price so much down that European producers would not be able to compete anymore. And I think that's one of the more promising discussions that we are having right now in the field of critical medicines, but maybe, who knows, could be expanded towards innovative products, because if we make the market more equal, we also enhance access, we also prevent parallel imports and exports which disrupt the market, so there's a promising avenue there.
Very interesting. And Stefan, what would your response be to that this could be a model for pricing of innovative medicines as well?
Well, well, my comment on generics and that piece is, I mean, we don't deal with generics. We're more into innovative medicines, but I think it's very important though that we have the same conditions when it looks to environment, how things are produced, and under what circumstances, how cheap can a medicine be, basically. So procurement systems, recommendation systems, formulary committees, we're welcoming that we get the environment part also included in that. So medicines also are manufactured in a very sustainable way that will equalize, I think, the competition globally on drugs and drug pricing, which I think is absolutely needed going forward. I think that is perhaps the most important thing in this.
Thank you. And I just want to finish with one last question, which I'd quite like to ask each of you to have a very short reply. I just want to think about what competitiveness in health actually means. And we often look at the US as having this great model especially for the sector. But if you look at competitiveness, it's a desire to be successful. And if you have a look at some of the outcomes for health in Europe, actually Europe is doing pretty well against the US. It spends a lot less of its GDP on healthcare, but yet has better health outcomes. People in Europe die older than they do in the US on average by around 3 or 4 years older. The US has higher death rates from avoidable and treatable conditions compared with other higher income countries. The rate of people with multiple chronic conditions and obesity rates are double in the OECD average for the US. So Europe is actually doing quite comparably pretty well on health outcomes. Julia, what's your response? I mean, if we're talking about competitiveness in health, is there a concern that we're focusing too much on industry and not really on what it is we're trying to achieve for patients?
I think it's an act of balance. It's an act of balance because, as you said, we live in health paradise as compared. If you talk competitiveness, it's always as compared. And you didn't say about equity, because some people in the States get incredible treatment and some don't and are not insured. But it's an act of balance. This can be done. This can be afforded if the European social model stays, which means overall competitiveness of the industry. And the pharma industry was singled out in the drug report, and I found it personally very important because it showed that is one among key sectors. So we have to make business easy for a number of sectors. And Mr. Draghi made some categories, and I would say that pharma enters in 2 sectors where we have an edge and we have to keep it. And in this case, also for the sake of citizens and their health, and the sector that is key to economic security. So it's something we have to do. But when you say it's not the focus in this industry, it's an industry that is important in so many levels for Europe, and it's worth looking at it while obviously looking at all these issues that I said about access, affordability, and safety. But this can be done if our societies can afford for it, and competitiveness of pharma and of industry in general is key to it.
Thank you. Gloria?
I very much agree. I think the competitiveness of the pharma sector has its own rights, and yet it is also connected to the fact that we have these excellent healthcare systems. Most pharma companies would also agree that it is worth investing in, for instance, prevention, which of course it means that you consume less medicines, but still most pharma companies tend to agree. I think you also need to invest in your health workforce, and this again connects to your competitiveness, because you cannot do clinical trials without a good, highly skilled health workforce. So I would say that yes, it's a very important issue that you raise. The quality of your health systems must be protected, but your competitiveness also.
I am conscious I'm eating into everyone's lunch, so if you'd like to respond to that question too, please.
Yeah, I'll keep it very brief, and maybe I'll just look from an industrial point of view as opposed to the healthcare perspective. I think it's so critically important for Europe, and indeed for all of us as citizens, that we have innovative healthcare companies. And in order to do that, we have to give them the framework for clinical trials to make sure they're successful, but we also need to make sure they can commercialise those products as well. So I think if we think about the transition, the digital transition, so critically important for the future of healthcare, and indeed energy, security, sustainable, affordable. They're going to be the elements that's going to set, I think, the next level of healthcare apart as well as we go forward.
Thank you.
Just very quickly, 3 or 4 years ago, healthcare became strategically important. That connection between having a healthy population, the impact on the economy, it drove all that collaboration that Julia talked about earlier. We aligned things. Unfortunately, 4 years on, healthcare's falling back into a cost. And we need to, if we seize it back as strategically important for Europe competitiveness across all dimensions, and make the connections and the changes that we've talked about, implement the regulations consistently, then that gives us the miracle cure you're looking.
Stefan.
Yeah, it's very hard to compare healthcare systems, and the US have their own problems. Europe needs to focus on their problems. They need to focus on making Europe attractive and stand on its own legs to attract investments in Europe. The 3 fundamentals: protect innovation with IP and regulatory data protection, 2, a fast, efficient regulatory approval system, clinical trials, simplification. These are fundamentals, no compromises, crystal clear step forward from the Commission would be very nice to see, because if we can have that, Europe will be very attractive. Secondly, and last, when it comes to the issues we have with populations and chronic disease, that's something that absolutely needs to be addressed. And we need to be more preventive. The healthcare budgets in Europe are 700 billion euro. 80% of that goes to chronic disease, 3% to prevention. When is prevention going to be seen as an investment? That I think we need to take a look at. And if we do that, Europe can be more forward-looking and address the real problems.
Thank you so much. I think I couldn't have said it much better myself. I could carry on questioning you all afternoon, but I will let you escape to have your lunch. Before you go, just a reminder that we have partners installations for you to enjoy whilst you're out there eating, and be back at 1:55 sharp for some sessions on trade with our colleagues from Politico. Thank you so much.
We are united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
If we do not renew our partnerships with the rest of the world, Europe will not be relevant.
We can make it if we are together as Europeans.
And looking ahead to what is next.
Do you genuinely believe that countries will manage to reach these very ambitious targets?